All right, here we go. I'm back again, and we're going to be reading from The Wounded Sky some more. This is Star Trek Story Time with Alex. We're on Chapter 7 today, as you've probably figured out from the introduction, from the title of the video. And before I can't words anymore, because it's been a long day, it's been a long several days, I'm going to begin reading, but not before I say, hey, yes, the equipment is changing little bit by little bit. I have a new differenter boom arm. I put the first mic I used back on my stand, and yes, I have a different camera that I've been using for a little while. Slowly upgrading stuff. These are all part of my day job that are, giving me more things to play with by night. 7. Time was gone again, too. That being the case, it seemed impossible to say that the experience took longer than the first one. But it seemed to. Or else, as Jim put it to himself later, when he could think again, the experience wasn't exactly longer, but deeper somehow? More real. The last time, there had been the very slightest sense that the real Jim Kirk was somewhere else. That sense was gone now, replaced by the knowledge, both bizarre and commonplace as in a dream, that he was someone else. The light of Sol glared down white on the snow, making him squint as he looked across the square at the Kremlin. At this early hour, the great towers of Novi Mosca to the west cast no shadow on the red fort and the parklands about it. He wondered what it was like 200 years ago when there was a city all about this spot, with city dirt and noises. Now there were only the gold glittering onion towers of St. Basil's, facing the red towers of the citadel across the square. High in the fiercely blue sky of winter, a hawk sailed over, calling. He shivered. He had not been here since he was a very small child. Before he could read, Luna had been his home. Before he could read, Luna had become his home. Crater bases like Bianchini under the shadow of the great Jura Range, or Maria bases like Flamsteed and Heragonius. That was when he had begun to read the great old stories of the ancient Tsars and the voyaging knights, the boyars, of evergreen forests that seemed to cover the world from horizon to horizon, and green plains that went on forever, from the polar ice to the Euxine, promising freedom and room to voyage, and along the way of the voyaging, mighty battles and adventures. When he read those tales, it was like waking up from a dream. He knew at last where his true home was. It had been bad then, going out on the surface in his pressure suit in dark lunar, and looking up at the blazing blue-green jewel, so close and so very far away, out of his reach forever, or until he grew up anyway. Moist Mother Earth, they called her in the old stories of the Bogatiri, the godling lords. He looked up at her with terrible longing from the cold dark aridity of the dusty moon, and swore great oaths in Bog's name that he would find a way to those green fields. He would walk the wild country and the noble cities where free-handed lords reigned in splendor. He would ride the lonely steppes and find some adventure for himself, the glory of matching himself against danger and great odds, and finding himself their equal. He looked back on those longings now and find them not childish, but deeper and truer than ever. His parents had shown no desire to move back home from the moon. His simplest way back was through Starfleet. Once in Academy, though, he had discovered adventure and danger and bold journeys enough in the spaces between the stars, more than enough to last him for the rest of his life. His love for the spirit of this land had led him out into a life richer than he had ever imagined. But this was still the heart of all his loves, and there was no more time to spend here. He was expected off-planet within the hour. He looked across at the silent walls of the Kremlin, where heroes lay buried, and men who had been mighty, or become that way. He looked past them to ancient kings and old lost glories, to dreams that failed and dreams that succeeded, and praised them one and all for daring to dream, to be. And then there was nothing more to do but go back to the work. And then there was nothing more to do but go back to the work this land had sent him to his own personal dreams and glories, the stars. He turned around to walk back to the flitter, noticing as he did so another figure standing in the snow far away, looking in his direction. Some brother, some child of the motherland. He waved at the man as he popped the roof. He waved at the man as he popped the roof of the flit open, slightly preoccupied. He had to get back to the fleet field at Kazalkum in a hurry. If his shuttle left without him, Captain Kirk wouldn't be interested in his explanation that he was late because he'd stopped to sightsee. Funny, though, now that he thought about it. The watcher in the snow was wearing command flag uniform, and there was something about the stance, the build. He laughed at himself as he brought the ion drivers up and lifted the little craft off the ground. He had Kirk on the brain this morning. Jim stood silent in the snow, watching the little silver ship leap up into the bitter cold air as if a bomb had blown it off the ground. If I'd given any thought to how he'd fly, I could have anticipated this, he thought, his breath going out white in front of him as he laughed. It matches him. The knight spurring his charger. Meanwhile, how am I able to be him and me at the same time? And is everybody else walking into other people's experiences too? Are any of us going to be the same after this? And it all changed. Home. Oh, God. Home. It had been too long. She was in her own workroom again at the base on Ayahrunstei, and the world windows were on, revealing the great thousand-ring globe of Sa-na Medain, hanging in the green-golden splendor over the snow-dusted, cratered stone of its satellite, in a sky that burned with stars. Everything was as she had left it the last time she'd gone away. The big gold-stone desk, hovering on its pressers in the middle of the room, the ranks of bookshelves, dustless but undisturbed, her work-pad up and running as usual where it lay on the desk. Her pressure suit was in its clamps and charged. "Been gone a while, Lee," the computer said to her. It was too good to be true. She hurried out from behind that desk and laid a hand on Mikkel's console. "That's for sure, Cherie. Auril, Vulcan, Andor, and Vercingetorix 4. Terra, any messages? Oh, God, I have a million things to tell you. I missed you." "I missed you too, ma chère. Dithra's been asking for you." Dithra too. Was there any joy that wasn't going to happen? "Open the door," she said. "I'm on my way. Do I need to take anything with?" "Just you," from the sound of her. The doorway to the left side of the room, beyond the inset cupboards and closets, shimmered with transporter effect. She practically ran through it, bursting out onto the beach. Golden sand and emerald sea and fierce green sky piled with citron-colored fair-weather clouds so bright they burnt the eyes. Her delight at homecoming was so acute it was almost a pain. "I sta midhe, I hnsma ter desirie," she shouted. I'm not going to shout that. For the sheer delight of loudness, looking hurriedly around her as she ran, and then immediately skidded to a stop. The beach wasn't empty as it usually was. She was surrounded. Terrible dark shapes of stone stood all about her, huge as monoliths or statues of old monstrous gods, but faceless, featureless, weather-worn and age-blunted, and alive. For a long few breaths they looked eyelessly down on her in silent, implacable regard. Then slowly they began to bend down over her with a frightening sound of stone grinding and rasping massively on stone. She looked up at them, shaking, unable to move as they bent closer, and shut the light away, a hand of stone closing with her in its fist. From the great rough shapes came a scent of scorched rock and a rumbling that vibrated in the bones like the speech of the moving earth. Their shadow closed about her. It became quite dark. Most of the inward-leaning shapes stopped still, though their rumbling continued. Only one bent lower, closer, till it hung right above her head, less seen than sensed, a hot smell of burning, a promise of crushing weight. She stood still until she couldn't bear her own stillness any more, then reached up and dared one more time to try what had always been impossible before. She threw her arms as far as she could around that low-bending shape, and her heart nearly burst with shock and joy as she felt it, pulled herself to it, held it tight. The rumble of the great voice entered her and shook her, blotting out the world until only she and it remained. Daughter, flesh daughter, how is it that you come to us in truth and not in dream? It was never your wont to be so solid when you were among us. She shook her head, not knowing the answer, not caring. This was impossible, and she knew it, for to the Namaday, the physical world in which the humanities moved was a dream they could not touch. And when she tried to touch their warm stone and companionship, her hands went through them as if they were ghosts. Often enough she had longed to be able to touch, just once, the strange creatures whose wisdom and slow-spoken hearts and inner beauty had long since turned one more liaison job into first friendship, then love. And now the wish had come true. "Dithra," she said in the speech, finding to her great amazement that for the first time she spoke it not haltingly, but with their own leisurely certainty. "All I well know is that some great marvel is on me, and I wish it not to end. And I have been long between the stars, and have seen much death and much life and many wonders, yet all my desire has been to return here, for my heart was sore without you, my people. We also have been sorrowful for lack of the untouched who had gone from us. Now you are gone no more, and neither are you untouched any longer, and if you will dwell with us again, that is well. But the truth says you will not. The truth has an end for you." Her eyes burned, and though that ashamed her, for she had seen hundreds die and worked on dry-eyed in their midst, there was no stopping the tears here and now. "This much I feared," she said. "Yet, though I dream all the rest of my life, this truth cannot be taken from me. For this little while we touched." "Daughter, we have touched always, and we will touch again, though you must break your bonds first. That is a light thing. You will do that some day in an instant. But go now. Your dream calls you back into it. We will always be here, as we always have been." She nodded, letting her hands lie for one last sweet moment against the hot stone of her companion. Dithra straightened up then, followed by the other Namadehe. I don't know how to say that word. Sunlight fell once more on the sand in the circle. She glanced down at it, noticing something interesting. Though the sun fell untroubled on her head, she still stood in shadow, as if some great bulk yet hung over her. "As always," Dithra said. She nodded, sorry to leave, but too joyous really to be sad, and walked back toward the door. There was a lot of work to do. Jim stood on the beach, behind the Namadehe, watching her go. "Fascinating," someone said beside him, in a whisper that was almost lost in surf crash. Jim glanced to his left. Spock was standing there, gazing at what Jim had been watching. A lone woman walking down the beach toward a dark opening in the empty air. She stepped through it, was gone. The doorway vanished. Spock glanced at Jim, then in another direction. Jim looked where Spock did. The Namadehe, like an interesting Stonehenge, had turned toward the two of them, and, eyeless, faceless, were staring at them. That calm, boneless rumble started again. "Mr. Spock," Jim said, "if you are indeed real and not an inversion hallucination, I think it would be a very good idea if we got out of here." "Sir, I was having the same thought, on both counts. If you have any suggestions—" "Emergence confirmed," said Cthulhu's voice, a little shakily. "Inversion complete. Targeting accurate. Navigations confirm." Faces were pale all over the bridge. Mr. Hemmings no exception. but his fingers danced with their usual speed over his console. "Positive lock on DG Magellanus Minoris," he said, less crisply than usual. "Distance 101,120 light-years. Retrolock on Rigel, 100,800 light-years. On course as plotted. Coordinates..." He trailed off. He might as well have, for no one was really listening. They were all staring at the view screen. "We're here," Mr. Hemming said. They were. The intelligence screen had widened its angle to enclose the most prominent object in sensor range. As a result, it held utter darkness, and at the heart of that darkness a great fiery whirlpool of stars. The whole galaxy at once. Ragged whooping and cheering started, both on the bridge and down in engineering. Jim let it go on for as long as it took him to swallow hard twice. "All right, as you were," he said then, and the bridge quieted. "Cthulhu, report." "The apparatus functioned without fault, Captain." "I'm not so sure," Jim said, rubbing his head. It ached. The shock of finding himself in a woman's body wasn't too difficult to bear, Jim having been in such a situation once before, and the mindset that came with it had been peculiar but congenial. Being Chekhov hadn't been too bad either. The headache, Jim thought, probably came from being suddenly forced to think in Russian. No language should have that many cases. "What about you?" I think I shall have to see Dr. McCoy myself, Captain. Evidently my species is resistant to inversion effect only to a certain point, which I passed." Her chiming had a thoughtful sound to it. Jim immediately had a second thought about his own experience, that he had been lucky to experience only the thoughts of other humans. Her headache's probably worse than mine. "Have Scotty relieve you when you've got things cleaned up down there, Cthulhu. And tell him I'll be seeing the department heads in main briefing. This date, .7. Kirk out." He looked over his shoulder. "Pass that on to the heads, Mr. Mahase, and get me sickbay." When he came on, McCoy sounded concerned. "We've got a few collapses among the crew, Captain." "Diagnosis?" "Emotional overload, similar to stress syndrome, but the overload seemed due to positive emotions rather than to anxiety or fear." "How are your two guinea pigs?" "They both had inversion experiences. I got a scan on Leah's. Damned if I know what to make of it." Jim said nothing for the moment. He knew what to make of it, and would let Bones know later. He glanced at Spock. The Vulcan met his eyes and nodded very slightly, then went back to what he was doing at his station. "But Dehenish is even more interesting than hers. While he had inversion effect, he didn't have the problem with duration that everybody else has been having. It's something to do with that Sadrau time sense, I think, or lack of time sense, rather. In any case, his profile will be complete in a few hours. We need a briefing." .7. "Good. It'll give everyone a chance to recover. Anything else, Jim?" "No, Bones. Keep up the good work. Out." And there was nothing else to do for a while. Jim looked around at his bridge crew, who all seemed to be doing their jobs as usual, and felt uneasy. There was something slightly off. It took him a moment to pinpoint it. He noticed that they were having difficulty looking at each other, as if they all knew uncomfortable secrets of one another's and didn't want to let on. Jim thought uneasily of the disasters that had attended the Enterprise's earlier attempts to leave the galaxy. What was likely to happen, he wondered, when crew people suddenly found themselves wandering through one another's innermost visions and dreams? "I'm not sure that I wouldn't prefer good old-fashioned insanity to this. This whatever this is," Jim thought. "I can't even talk to Starfleet. Not that they could give me any useful advice if I did." "Mr. Spock," he said, getting up, "run whatever checks on the ship you think appropriate to the circumstances. Special attention to the engines, and also to the information systems this time. This would be a poor place to have something go wrong with the sensors. Crew in need of seeing Dr. McCoy are to do so as quickly as possible. Have them make arrangements with sickbay. That goes for bridge crew as well." he said, looking around the circle. Various strained-looking faces glanced up from their work, and there were mutters of acquiescence. Acknowledged, Spock said, stepping down to take the command chair. Where will you be if we're needed, Captain? Where will you be if you're needed, Captain? My quarters. Then, observation deck. Officially, of course, it was Recreation Deck Level 1. That was the name on the plate by the doors, and the one that appeared in the Enterprise's plans. But the crew never called it that, even though the deck truly was located directly above Recreation proper and connected to it by stairs and lifts. Much more significant to the crew was the fact that observation was the only part of the ship, except for scuttleports and such, not armored in proof with the monocrystalline iridium-rhodium alloy so resistant to phaser blasts and shock, even though the huge windows were clear steel 2 feet thick, triply reinforced, and fail-safed by both the skin field and their own redoubtable bracing. They were still the Enterprise's most vulnerable spot. The crew, who wouldn't have given up the windows for anything, nonetheless usually referred to the observation deck by any number of joking names, most of which had to do with various physical orifices up which an assailant could shove something if you weren't very careful. There were other names, the second most popular being Deck Double AZ, almost absolute zero. Though they were field insulated, the windows were unfailingly chill. Touching them, you could always get a taste of the terrible cold outside. A black winter that no outpouring of sun's light would ever break. The casualness of the names, though, masked the chief attraction of the deck: the stars. Jim had noticed a long time back that when the Enterprise was in real space, the observation deck was rarely empty on any shift, evidently as people liked to see where they'd been, or where they were going, or what their jobs were about, and for all their fidelity of reproduction, the view screens didn't seem to satisfy that need somehow. Often, too, there was more involved than mere sight, for many people didn't so much look at anything as simply gaze out. The hugeness, one of the Andorian crew had said quietly one day while she leaned near him on the railing of the upper level. The immensity. She had trailed off. Jim hadn't been sure whether she'd been speaking to him or not, but after a few moments he answered her. Yes, Ensign, he'd said. The hugeness. The trillions of miles. And moving in it. The smallness of planets. Of us. It awes me. She'd glanced over at him then, with gentle surprise that he'd mistaken her meaning. Oh, I didn't mean that hugeness, sir, she'd said, momentarily just as surprised Jim had put up an eyebrow at her, by way of inviting her to continue. That's just the universe, she'd said offhandedly, looking back out at the night. It's just bigness, a physical symbol for another kind of magnitude, that's all. It's worth praising for its magnificence, certainly, but being awed by that without also thinking of what's beyond it would be like, I don't know, like praising a wonderful menu and then not eating the meal it was about. And then she'd remembered who she was talking to and had blushed azure and fallen silent, unable or unwilling to talk about what hugeness she perceived beyond the physical one. But Jim had leaned beside her and contemplated the question for a long time before going back to duty. That was the way the observation deck usually was, though. People went there alone, or gathered in quiet 2s and 3s, and larger groups, talking or being silent as it pleased them. And one could say all kinds of astonishing things there and not hear a sound of surprise from anyone, not hear a comment spoken of in amusement or derision afterwards. It was chiefly on the observation deck that Jim realized the term humanities was no euphemism, no non-discriminatory fiction, though he rarely put the statement to himself just that way. That was what the deck was like in normal space, with the stars all about them. But here, in the great darkness between the galaxies, things were a bit different. There were more people on deck at any given time, and the groups seemed larger than usual, and they were all much quieter. The quiet, too, had more than the usual considerateness about it. There's a reverence, Jim thought as he leaned alone on the railing. I don't think I felt anything like this even in the chapel, and I'm not surprised. He leaned further forward on the railing, feeling the slight breath of chill from the clear steel against his face and hands. He knew ship sensors and the incomparable solid cameras were recording the vista, but he still felt sorry for all the people who couldn't be here, now, seeing this. Despite all the stars he'd seen, all the blazing skyscapes, he was amazed again. Away beyond Enterprise, the galaxy hung, its spiral structure clearly visible for the first time in the history of the humanities. A spiral even more complex in the subtleties of its structure than the astrophysicists had suspected. But the sober structural details were themselves defined by and composed of a dust of silver-golden light so delicate that only the most remarkable stars could be made out as discrete entities. Others melted together in a tantalizing shimmer that defeated human eyes entirely, and from conversation Jim heard here and there, left even Tellurids and Menetso squinting. Yet all the delicacy did not prevent the home of the human. We're having a hard time again. Yet all the delicacy did not prevent the home of the humanities from burning fiercely in the dark. A still, relentless, profligate fire that left its prints on the eyes when they turned to the utter cool dark beyond it. Close to the galaxy, that dark wasn't quite so complete. There was also the halo of globular clusters that surrounded the Milky Way, bright silver-blue spatters against the night. Out beyond the halo, the most isolated of the globular clusters, NGC 2419, the Far Wanderer, sailed along on its solitary course like one bright and independent angel parted from the rest of the heavenly host. But elsewhere was nothing. Not even a wandering star had come out this far, and the blackness was total. Suspended in it, huge, majestic, unmoving, the great whirlpool of suns hung and burned in silence, and the clear steel wall breathed the ancient cold in which it hung. Jim leaned on the railing and watched the galaxy as steadfastly as if it might be stolen should he turn his back. He stayed that way for a long time. The administrative parts of his mind got bored in a hurry and insisted that he get back to work, that he'd been here long enough by now to know what this looked like. But he didn't move. At one point he looked over to one side and noticed that Uhura had come from somewhere. Or other. And noticed that Uhura had come from somewhere or other to stand beside him in the same silent reverie. For a long time he didn't say anything, though they traded glances when he first noticed her. Finally, "Off shift?" he asked. "Department head's privilege," she said, easing her elbows down onto the railing to match his pose. Jim nodded. His heads could rotate their active shifts any way that pleased them, as long as they spent enough time on each to adequately supervise each of the 4 shifts in their department over a given 2-month period. "This would normally be morning for me, but I wanted to be here at night. So do a lot of my people, evidently." Jim nodded, smiling slightly. The computer, somewhat bemused, had told him that such shift trading and shuffling was going on all over the ship. "Some dawn for you," he said. "Well, it is." "It is." Uhura didn't take her eyes away from the great silent pool of light. "First time any of us have seen this light, after all." "I would hardly say that, Lieutenant," said the quiet voice on Jim's left hand. Jim didn't even have to move. He just let out a small breath of amusement and gazed out into the dark, listening to the old familiar game among his officers begin. "This light has rarely left Enterprise's hull since her keel was flown. For an expert in communications, you exhibit a shocking imprecision of expression. Were you instead to say that you have never seen the galaxy in this particular fashion—" "Mr. Spock," Uhura said with great affection, "you are incorrigible." "Only impermeable, Lieutenant," Spock said. His voice was calm as usual and revealed nothing, but Jim stole a sideways glance and saw that shadow of a smile that Spock occasionally wore. The Vulcan did not lean on the railing. He stood straight, but his stance had comfort about it, and his eyes were lifted up to the great darkness as if inviting it to appreciate his humor. though not to do anything so gauche as laugh out loud. It cooperated. Jim bent his head a bit, speaking only for Spock to hear. I was going to congratulate you on your timing, by the way. Sir? Getting out of there. We were there. Surely I was, and I perceived you to be. Mind link? Again, I think not, sir. Though stress on either member of a team that has mind melded in the past will sometimes reactivate the linkage, this experience did not have the same flavor. Also, I was unable to break it, as I would have been able to do were it a true link, so I must decline the congratulations with regrets. We must look for another solution, and I suspect a more complex one. You want something complex? Jim said, glancing toward the stars. Here it comes. No, came a chiming voice that was slowly making its way up to the level where they stood. Try it with another set of names for the relatedness aspects. Call them change, transformation, and source. But change and transformation are the same thing, aren't they, lass? No. Change is one-dimensional alteration of form alone, say, smashing a rock with a hammer and breaking it. Transformation is two-dimensional alteration of substance, turning the non-living rock into a live flower. Source is three-dimensional, an alteration of essence, producing a state in which rocks not only turn themselves into flowers, but are enabled to have other rocks turn into flowers. Oh, come now, lass. That is magic you're talking. Possibly. The English term I always associated with it was miracle, though, because there's a paraphysical context to the source concept. Religious, you would say. Can you use magic as a religious word in this context? Scotty, Jim said, in greeting as the Scot and the Homolki came up the stairs together and joined the group at the rail. Catullus? Captain, the two of them said. Catullus sat down just under the rail, tucking her legs in, and Scotty, standing beside her on Uhura's far side, looked up and got his first good look at the view outside. Oh my, he said, and leaned on the rail, saying nothing more for a while. Mr. Spock, Jim said, I meant to ask you, do you understand this physics of Catullus? I believe I understand some of its premises. I believe I understand some of its premises, the Vulcan said, though I hope the commander will correct me if I err. He inclined his head to Catullus. She shook herself in wind chime acquiescence. The concepts tend to be quite novel. Probably the most novel is the assertion that not only all classical and modern physics, but all other affiliated and non-affiliated phenomena of physical existence are both aspects and direct creations by enactment of the minds that move through them. In other words, in this scholium, one may say that the laws of motion are the way they are, specifically because, among infinite other causes and causality itself has some novel definitions and operations in the system, because Newton was an accurate enough observer of the universe around him to correctly deduce and declare the nature of those laws. And so, a Homolki physicist would say, it was that accuracy, that truth of declaration, that itself set those laws into the universe from its very beginning. He created or ordained those laws. The only sense in which he discovered them by the criteria of this school of physics would be that sense in which a sculptor might turn on the lights in his workroom and discover one of his own statues there. Thus the popular name creative physics. There was an amiable snort from a ways down the railing to Spock's left. Jim glanced in that direction and noticed that McCoy had joined them, and Harb Tanzer was leaning on the railing on Bones' far side. How do you discover a statue you have yet to sculpt? McCoy said in good-natured derision. Because you have sculpted it even before you pick up your first chisel. This time, scheme discards both succession, cause and effect, and simultaneity, as fragmented and incomplete glimpses of the larger continuum in which both coexist. In such a scheme, the rude comment you will make in a moment has existed complete since the beginning of time. It was, and is, and shall be, to borrow a phrase, forever and ever. McCoy glared at him and said nothing. Harb laughed. But Mr. Spock, he didn't say it. That is entirely like the doctor, the Spock said with an expression of mild annoyance. He cheerfully flouts the natural course of a whole universe to prove me wrong. There was laughter about that. We would say that he simply created it otherwise than Spock did, Catullus chimed, merry-voiced, just as more complex structures like scholia of physics can be expanded by later scientists, and their creations are no less true than those of their predecessors. Spock nodded, keeping his face very neutral. Jim noticed that. And what do you think about the School of Physics, Mr. Spock? I think, Spock said gravely, that there may at last be some things that Vulcans were not meant to know. But with this school of thought in mind, there's one thing about the inversion drive that's disturbed me, Catullus said, musing. I'm troubled by the constant attendance of difficulty on the testing. The drive does, after all, involve the breaking of natural law, a number of natural laws, every time we use it. Such breaches can't be without consequences. You're saying that the universe is giving us fines for moving violations? McCoy drawled. Jim chuckled. Why, Leonard, you surprise me, Catullus said. One of your own terrene philosophers says otherwise. Small, his name was, or Short, something like that. The universe doesn't give first warnings, except in a most circumstantial fashion, and never as a favor. I'm beginning to suspect these incidents are something of the sort. That's all. I must admit, Spock said slowly, that I also have been disturbed about the drive, but for different reasons. There was no reason for Zeta 10 Scorpii to have gone nova when we left its neighborhood, except one. There is a possibility that it was our bending or breaking of natural law in the neighborhood that caused that star to explode. The consequences lie within the parameters for what such an integrity breach backlash might look like. Dr. McCoy looked from Spock to Catullus and shook his head. That sounds like superstition to me. That natural law is unbreakable I can just barely accept. But the idea that breaking it might make bad things happen to you. Catullus shook herself, chiming. Many Earth-human physicists might agree with you about how it sounds, while also agreeing with me about the soundness of my hypothesis. For centuries, since your post-atomic times at least, some prominent Terran theorists have been noticing what seem to be linkages between old traditions of your world about the way life works, the Tao, I think the term is, and classical physics, especially the scholia that deal with subatomic particle interactions. Most specifically, if you force a particle to do something it can't ordinarily do, then somewhere else a particle will do something slightly catastrophic or chaotic to even the balance, inches away or miles. Evidently, though, physical law may be altered. It's not to be flouted with impunity while in operation. Even our meddling ceases sooner or later. When our meddling ceases, sooner or later the universe will snap back and remind us of the rules. Even in the commonest branches of physics, this is true. Equations must balance. Nothing be created or destroyed. I'm becoming disturbed by the things that are happening coincidental with our use of the inversion apparatus. I don't suggest we sit on it and do nothing, but I do suggest that we be prepared to deal responsibly with the consequences we produce by using it. Jim turned that one over in his mind once or twice, watching with some interest the thoughtful expressions on the others' faces. Spock in particular interested himself. The Vulcan was wearing an impassivity even deeper than usual. He wanted to see that stillness move a bit, or find out what was underneath it. Could it be, then, he said, by way of starting the process, that we are literally things, man or Vulcan? That there are literally things man or Vulcan isn't meant to know or do? I wouldn't say meant, Catullus said. Meaning implies sentience. You would have to tell me who was doing the meaning. The physical universe lacks sentience. If you asked one of the thinking planets about that, McCoy said dryly, It might give you an argument. D.D. Tory 5 is especially touchy on the subject, if I remember right. Keeps throwing planet quakes at the research colony when the subject comes up in conversation. There are exceptions to everything, Leonard, Catullus said affably, and as Mr. Spick has noted, you usually make sure of where they are so you can throw a simian wrench into the conversation. Eyes crinkled with amusement all up and down the line. I say again, meant is an inaccuracy. Rather, the occurrence of consequences to actions performed in the universe's domain is simply part of its basic structure. We may act as we wish in regards to, say, gravity or light speed in normal space, but we'd best be prepared for the falls and time dilation effects that come of playing with them. In the case of the inversion drive, I suspect the consequence might be that one breach of integrity would be paid for with another, the way lies are eventually paid for in painful truth, or more conventional law-breaking with enforcement. A breach in psychic integrity, for example, Harb said. Is that what these inversion experiences are? Very likely. Or the backlash could as easily involve an attack on our physical integrity. It may have, if the damage to the Portness cell was an example of the backlash, too. I knew you were a physicist, Jim said, but it's beginning to sound like you're an ethicist, too. For my people, there's no difference, Catullus said, sounding somber for the first time since Jim had met her. I have to admit, I've never understood how your physics neglects to include the ethical mode, as if only one part of life were mathematics, rather than all of it. The physical universe, after all, is what determines the nature of the bodies and brains we're hooked into. Ah, Scotty said, the old human soul as software line of reasoning, eh, lass? That it's lasted as long as it has in both our cultures might make you suspect there's something there worth investigating, Montgomery. From my people's standpoint, the major design limitation of matter, specifically that it's subject to physical law, time and space, mathematics, and so forth, can't help but dictate, to a certain extent, the way the self inhabits a body. For your lifetime, that self is bound into a condition mostly subject to the dictates of the laws that bind matter and energy. How, then, should you be surprised that your lives have a certain logic and a certain mathematics about them, that service is sooner or later repaid with service, and violence with violence, death with death, and life with life? Do unto others, Spock said quietly, as you would have others do unto you. Heads turned to look at him. He gazed back, unruffled. Or as the Vulcans would say, Catullus, the spear in the other's heart is the spear in your own. You are he. Common sense. So many species have noticed this, that if you assist others, you'll eventually be assisted yourself. You can't put energy into a system and not get it back again, sooner or later. It may come back so late that you don't see a connection between deed and result. But there is one, unfailingly. Action and emotion are both energy, and energy is conserved. Catullus chimed softly for a moment. Not words, but a reflective little sound. There are deeper implications involved here than the mere desirability of mutual assistance, of course. She looked up at Spock, just as it wasn't only survival of your species Surak had in mind when he first began to teach the mastery of emotion. There was something else. Mehektoth. Spock lowered his eyes. Kirk looked from him to Catullus. Vulcans are so private, she said, chiming more softly than before, that they can barely agree among themselves on how to translate their language. And they don't presume to correct others' translations. Look how the lexicons have been mistranslating Arie Menu, passion's mystery, as suppression of emotion all these years. Mehektoth is even more difficult to render. But it's integrity again, not in any of the new meanings, truthfulness and keeping promises and so forth, but in the old sense of the parent languages of Anglish. In the same skin with, the word said. The basic kinship of souls, however diverse, the one thing all species have in common under body shape and the superficial diversities of logics and life goals and philosophies and judgments of good and evil, their soulness, their selfness, and their independence won and later and now from the physicality which houses them, in which for the time being they've chosen to be housed. "There, lassie," Scotty said very quietly. "I think we differ a mite. I don't so much see myself as having done the choosing, as having been chosen to be here and now, by a power better equipped than myself to do the choosing." Kirk kept his eyes to himself, wondering slightly. He'd never heard Scotty's voice go so gentle except when discussing a particularly beautiful piece of design. Then again, Jim thought, maybe he is. "I find truth in that, Montgomery," Catullus said as gently. "I honor that, and I honor as well our mutual diversity and your willingness to let the divergence be all right. Your logic and your biochemistry I find peculiar, and to me you seem a bit short of limbs. Yet we're in the same skin, you and I, and we can celebrate that undistressed by our belief systems and differences. Certainly our differences as two people, and on a wider scale as a galaxy full of peoples, are infinite and worthy of celebration. And our likeness, at all our trillions of cores, transcends and informs those differences. We know ourselves to be. The duration or nature of that being doesn't much matter. Our ourness is the heart of our kinship. The spear in your heart is the spear in mine. We're one." The communicator whistled in the middle of Catullus' last few words, so stridently that some of the others started at the shattering of the tranquil mood. Jim started less violently than the others. He had learned better than most that a starship was for either excitement or boredom, rarely for tranquility. Astrocartography to Mr. Spock. "Spock here, Lieutenant Sagatti." "Sir," Mary Sagatti's voice came back in great excitement. "Would you please come down here? We have a problem." "If you would describe its nature, Lieutenant." Mary sounded as if she were perplexed and frightened and wanting very much to laugh, all at once. "Sir, we have data from the Lesser Magellanic that would seem to indicate that the universe in this neighborhood is either blowing up or stuck. Would you come and tell us which?" "On my way. Spock out." Jim turned and saw that, indeed, the Vulcan was already down the stairs and halfway out of recreation entirely. "Post is appropriate, everybody," he said, and took off after. Well, that was a more spiritual chapter than perhaps I was expecting. I think it's time for me to be done. Have yourselves a good night.